Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the Gentrio podcast. As always, I am your host, Jacob Murphy. Joining me today is Tricia Montalvo Timm. She is a first-generation Latina Board Director, investor, and author of bestseller Embrace the Power of You. Tricia, welcome in.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
So I want to start by having our audience get to know you a little more. So why don't we start by having you take us through your career a little bit and explain how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, happy to. So, I think it's interesting to hear about the journey from both the professional perspective as well as the personal perspective, because they're a little different. On the professional side, I've spent almost 30 years working in Silicon Valley with high-tech companies, big and small, from startups to late-stage companies to large multinational global corporations. I started my career as a corporate associate at a very large corporate law firm back in the 90s, and my career has been phenomenal. I've been worked at a law firm. I worked in-house as an in-house attorney, culminating in a general counsel role at a company called Looker, which was a data analytics company, which we sold to Google in 2020 for $4.6 billion. It was Google's fourth largest acquisition. And so, it's been a phenomenal ride, if you will, being able to work with incredible entrepreneurs and investors and bankers. But on the personal side, as you said, I'm a first-generation Latina. I was born to two immigrant parents in Hollywood, in Los Angeles, California, and grew up, Spanish was my first language. And my parents wanted, like many immigrants in our country, a better life for their family. So when I was about to turn 5 or 6 years old, they moved us out of the city and into the accompanying suburbs, where quickly I found that I was different. Our family was one of the few at the time Latino families in a predominantly white community. I went to Catholic school. And so at a very early age, my parents encouraged me to assimilate and blend in because they thought that would be the best way for me to be successful in this country. And so I would say my identity and my foundation of like trying to figure out where I belong in this world started then.
Mm-hmm. And I'm assuming you probably discussed some of that in the Embrace the Power of You.
I do. Yeah, we talk about, my young life and starting a career, and as a first generation professional, no matter, what your background is, if you're the first one sort of moving up that social mobility ladder, it's all new. You don't have family or friends or a network to really give you guidance on how it's all supposed to work and networking and career planning and all of that. So you're trying to figure it out all on your own. Mm-hmm. And that's a really lonely place to be.
Mm-hmm. So, as you discuss in your book, the topic of identity seems really important. And I just want to ask, as you progress through these different stages of your life, when was it that you really started to pay attention to identity? Because I think we all understand what identity really means, but not as many people are too heavily focused on it and notice the importance of it. So when did that importance of identity really start standing out to you?
That's a great question. I would say race was not the first thing that I really focused on in terms of identity. I would say gender. Mm-hmm. Gender identity, I was, because I started my career in corporate law, in enterprise software, it was and still is a pretty male-dominated industry. And so I was often the only woman in the room. There were no women in leadership. I also am a parent, and so I had my two daughters while working full-time. And so it stood out to me very early in my career, the challenges of being a woman in the workplace. So I would say gender identity, but I knew that I had these challenges and roadblocks, and I figured out how to navigate through them. But the awareness of gender identity being, something that I had to own and figure out was probably the first thing. And then I would say, there was a one point in my career where I decided I was going to off ramp to have a little more flexibility in my life. And so I stopped sort of climbing the corporate ladder and started my own consulting business so I could work from home. And not having a title, like not being general counsel, actually was a difficult transition because you're sort of tied up into your titles. And when people say, what do you do? Or where do you work? Or, so then getting comfortable saying, I'm taking an alternate path here. I started struggling with that identity. And then I would say racial and ethnic identity actually was later for me because I had downplayed my ethnic identity in the workplace so much that I didn't bring my Latin background into the workplace. So I didn't really have to struggle with it in that way.
And would you say, I think it seems clear that your sense of identity, well, you seem to have always known what it is, has changed over the years just in terms of how you view it. Would that be fair to say?
Oh, it's changed tremendously. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think at the core of who we are as human beings is we want to belong. Mm-hmm. So we learn at a very young age how to fit in. And so for me, downplaying my racial and ethnic identity was basically like a strategy to survive in an environment that I saw no one that looked like me or had a lived experience like me. But what happens is you spend so much time and energy sort of adapting to the environment around you, it's in a number of different ways, from language, what you wear, what you say, what hobby you do, like all of these things, it becomes exhausting. And so I would say about 2 decades into my career, I started to hit a burnout point where I just couldn't juggle it all. I didn't have the energy to do it anymore. And that's where I started what I would say is my journey into really reclaiming that part of who I am, my ethnic background, and really just becoming more of where I came from.
Okay, so what did that look like? What was that journey of reclaiming identity? What did that look like for you?
I would say, first it just started learning self-awareness and learning about who you are and in all different sorts of ways. And with that, just doing inner work around that. And then, there was this aha moment. So, I was doing therapy to get through all of that and unpacking my childhood and things. And it was through that experience where my therapist asked, she knew about my family and background, asked, whether I talk about my, my child, like where I came from and my culture and my traditions at work. Mm-hmm. And my initial gut reaction was, oh God, no, like I don't talk about that at work. No, I don't bring that to work. And she just sort of sat back and said, wow, like she just was deflated. Like, mm-hmm. Oh, that's so sad because it's such a beautiful part of who you are, that is, people would really enjoy learning about that. And it was the first time where I thought, wow, they're actually my background, where I came from, my struggle, like that actually could be a positive rather than a liability. It started that thought process of like, oh, instead of focusing on I'm going to be discriminated against or people won't give me credibility or respect X, Y, and Z, I reframed it into, wow, this is something where people might be interested in, might be curious about, and what a role model I can be for people like me who are starting their careers, who also aren't seeing anyone that look like them. So I started just reframing it.
Yeah, we actually talked a little bit about this in my podcast that I recorded last week, where we talk about how in there's the group and there's the individual, in terms of being a part of the group and then as opposed to your individuality, and how there can be benefits to being in the group. But would you agree that there's a balance that needs to be walked where you can be a part of a group, whether it's in your career or in a personal life, or uh, being around people who you identify similarly with, but you don't want that group to be the influence of your identity, whereas you want your identity to be your primary, who you are, obviously, and then you can bring that to the group, have the benefits of being in the group, but also bring your identity in. And it seems, as I'm talking about it now, that seems like, oh, of course, why wouldn't you? That's so simple. But it is a lot harder when you experience it, especially in a career, in a professional part of your life. Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, there's a huge amount of benefits to being part of a group. And I would say that there's two things that have to happen. One, the group needs to create a space of psychological safety so that differences can be celebrated in that group. If the group moves into this like group think where the dominant is the way the group accepts others, then you coming in with the difference, you're not going to feel comfortable in that group. And so the first thing is noticing, is the group actually celebrating, welcoming, creating psychological safety for anybody to belong in that group. And then the second thing is you have to believe that whatever difference you might have is good enough, and that it's actually something that is valuable and interesting, and your thought, while different, or your identity, while different, actually is something that's going to bring value to the group. If you don't believe that yourself, then you're, not coming in with your full self, your full ideas and opinions and perspectives, and that's where the disconnect happens.
And I also think that, especially in today's day and age, we live in a very groupthink seeming kind of society, and I think another big problem with that is once you're a part of a group, the way that the outside views that group is how you're now going to be viewed instead. So I think, there's work that needs to be done within the group in terms of what you just spoke to, but also from people outside of groups thinking, oh, what's the assumption, and that's how everyone in there must be. And remember that group is made of individuals. In your book, you talk about the scan, evaluate, adapt problem. What is that, and can you explain it in a little more detail? Because that piqued my interest when I read about it a little bit.
Yeah, so it's a process, I would say, that I coined to describe a strategy that I used to navigate my corporate career. And so, when you are the first or the only in the room, like we just talked about, it's hard to be different. And so the strategy that I came up with, which, by the way, is not really a great strategy, but it's a survival strategy, is that I would walk into a setting, evaluate the room in a number of different ways, and really kind of figuring out who's in the room. Is it, are they, senior leaders? Are they men, women? Are they, who is there, and how am I going to be deemed accepted in this group? And so, like, if I was at a cocktail party, if I'm talking to a senior male partner at a law firm, I would not talk about, my young children at home. I would try to talk about, the latest trends in the stock market. If I was talking to a young female colleague, I would try to, talk about things that her and I might be interested in. So I would just sort of like adapt myself into what I perceived they would be comfortable with me, rather than me just being me and talking about whatever connection that person and I might have. And I didn't even realize I was doing this until, I would notice my husband, who's a white male, he was just himself in every setting. He didn't think about it. And so he would talk about babies and colic and being up at night with anybody. And it didn't seem to matter. Whereas I was very conscious of bringing that part of my life into a setting that I thought might jeopardize my career.
Do you think that it's, you mentioned not safety mechanism, survival mechanism. Do you think that, because I'm sure a lot of our listeners and I certainly can relate to that, the first thing that comes to mind for me when I read scan, evaluate, adapt is, kind of similar, going up to a group of people and wanting to fit in. Like I know I've had in the past friend groups where I act a certain way with one friend group and then I act a certain way with a different friend group. And if there was ever a situation where those two friend groups meet, I almost feel weird because I'm just like, well, how am I supposed to be?
Yeah.
And that is something I've thought about and, I've tried to grow out of too. But do you think it's just a survival method or something that people are innately using just to feel like they're going to be accepted?
Well, as I mentioned, I think it's human nature to want to belong.
Yeah.
So I think that we want to belong. I mean, it starts in middle school, right? We want to belong in the playground, and we start adapting ourselves at that age. So, it is a strategy. But what happens over time is that, if you are part of the dominant group, whatever dominant looks like in a particular setting, it's very easy to be yourself. Mm-hmm. Because everyone around you accepts you as yourself. It's when you're different from whatever the dominant is that's when being yourself is hard. Mm-hmm. And that's when you have to do these strategies. And so that's why, people of color, members of the LGBTQ plus community, all of these identities that are different from what's dominant, actually struggle more with that situation.
Yeah. And I'd like to think that as, I mentioned earlier in today's day and age that we're a very groupthink society, but I'd also like to think that we've gotten better, especially in the dominant groups of being accepting and allowing individuality to seep through. Yeah. So let's talk about Gentrio just a little bit. So you are an investor of Gentrio, and I just wanted to ask, going from selling that company to Google for more money than I'll ever see in my entire life, and writing a book about identity. What drew you to our company?
Yeah, so I am thrilled to be an investor in Gentrio. So one of the things as I pivoted out of what I'll say my operational GC hat was I wanted to see a couple of things. I wanted to invest in female entrepreneurs. And so I was looking for that in the companies that I was investing in.
Shout out to our amazing CEO and COO, Renee and Julie Fry.
Yes. And the company and its solution was hitting an exact experience I was living through. I am what you would call being in the sandwich phase of life. I'm raising two daughters, one who's in college, the other off to college in a few months. Mm-hmm. And I'm blessed to still have my two parents alive with me. My dad turned 90 last week and my mother's 86. And so I'm caregiving, I would say, on both ends. And so with that in mind, I really wanted to make sure, from a financial and estate planning perspective that, everything is in order. And so for my parents, making sure that I knew, about their estate, about what their wishes were, about where documents are, where passwords are, where are all the things so that we can be prepared. And then for my kids, making sure my estate was in a place that would be, put together for them should anything happen. So it just was, right, before Gentrio, literally everything was in a folder or on a piece of paper or, sticky notes. And mm-hmm. So it automated and provided a solution to a real problem.
Okay. Well, I'm glad you found, that you enjoy, you see what we're trying to do out here. And for our audience listening, I don't know if I've ever actually said it on the podcast, but what Gentrio means is generation trio, 3 generations, which is exactly what Tricia just said, caring for your aging parents, caring for yourself and your own estate and your own legacy, and then also caring for, the generation that comes after you. So what she described is exactly, the mission that we've been striving to be able to help with in an industry that truly did need a little bit of renovation,
Yeah.
innovation.
Yeah.
So what connections did you find with the concept of identity, in your book? Just because I want to make sure we keep the book on top of mind because I really enjoyed what you wrote about. Did you find in your estate planning journey any connections with the kind of concept of identity that we've talked about so far?
I think that's such a great question because I hadn't thought about identity as it pertains to estate planning, and I would say I'm a bit of an anomaly than most. I would say most first generation families, in the sense that my mother was actually a manager of a bank, so she worked her way up from being a bank teller to a manager of a local bank. And so she was all about financial planning, budgets, estate planning. When I started my first job, it was like, get 401k right away. And so I had, I would say, financial literacy at a young age. But as I have delved into the struggles of first generation and immigrants and those communities, or low income communities, financial literacy and estate planning and generational wealth. I mean, it just was, it's not anything that is talked about, is discussed. So there's a huge amount of education that has to happen in that area so that communities, low income communities and communities of color, really understand, one, how to really manage all these aspects. And I mean, there's, tax advantages. There's so many different, repercussions if you're not doing the right planning. And so I think that is a huge component of, reaching out to various communities.
Yeah. And I think, to me, what I thought of when I, was bridging the gap between estate planning and identity was, especially in, kind of what you talked about with first generation, families. A lot of times, the terror stories that we hear in the estate planning world is when a family who has, huge amount of wealth that's already been accumulated and someone passes away and there's fighting over who gets all the money. And, that's already a tough thing to deal with. But in this situation, you have first generation family that probably started off, having to work their way, like you said with your mom, work her way through a bank and build herself up to where she is. And now having, making sure that built up start to what could be like, a legacy of passed down. What was the phrase you just used? I say
generational wealth.
Exactly. Generational wealth.
Yeah.
I find that when talking to people that the sense of identity is so much stronger in that in that scenario, because when you're first generation family building up that wealth, you don't have, all this, you're not one of these situations where it's all the millionaire grandparents passed away and they passed something down. It's like, no, you had the close knit family and you guys were working your way to what you wanted. And there's not as much of that drama of, oh, who gets what, let's fight about it. It's like, let's preserve this legacy that we've built up. And I think identity really does stand out in that situation.
Yeah, you're exactly right. My parents came to this country with literally nothing. And so they've had to earn every single dime that they have. And it's funny now in their 90s, they still are pinching every penny. And I keep telling them, wait, just, spend some money, enjoy it. But what's interesting now, as you say, the trio, as I think about my own kids, for example, as a child of immigrants, I never expected any inheritance. I never expected anything. So I had to build my own life on my own to make it, right? Now, as I look at my kids, we've had to be very intentional in making sure that they also are driven to create, build their own lives and not rely on generational wealth, because otherwise then that's when you see all of that sort of going away. So, it's an interesting journey.
I just on the other side of things, this is just kind of philosophical for our audience, but I think also identity, in that other situation that I talked about where you might have a large amount of money that's about to be spread through the family through, estate planning, which hopefully has been done, especially if you have that huge amount of money, just because I always have to harp on that, get it done. But I think identity, it also struck me in that situation where, and I've seen it with families that in my personal life that I thought were just the most tight-knit families, even if they came from money, and then suddenly the money's up for grabs and things fall apart. And I'm like, what was this family's identity, and why was it able to be crumbled by something like this? And I think, when having these conversations about estate planning with families at home, it's important to not only have that individual identity and stay true to that, but a family identity, so the money doesn't ruin it.
Oh, 100%. And I think, my mom, because she worked at a bank, used to always come home and say, I had clients who literally, were saving every dime, saw them for, served them for 30 years. They passed away and their kids would come in, fight over the money, and spend it all within a year.
Yeah.
And she was so heartbroken to see how that could occur over and over and over again. And so I think that's a real issue. And then as you talked about identity, the other thing that I think is interesting is two things came to mind. One was like social mobility, like moving up that ladder. And, it's for my husband and I both came from working families. It's just ingrained in us and, how we spend. We're very mindful of where every dollar goes, no matter what our situation is. So that, that habit we've tried to instill in our children. And we're also starting a new thing that, my parents didn't have the real luxury to have, which is think about philanthropy. Where can we, contribute to the betterment of things we're passionate about in the world. I think that should be a concept around estate planning as well.
Yeah. And, as we talk about these situations, I also want to emphasize, like, I understand it's not so, open and shut. I'm sure that there are families who struggle with, kids who truly do just don't get along, or families that have broken and fallen apart, or families that have split up and now extended into, different families and step families. And there can be conflict in there, but I do emphasize to our listeners, like, even if it's a tough situation, it's worth figuring out beforehand so that, heartbreaking situations like what Tricia just spoke to don't have to occur. But, it's just interesting that you bring up that second piece about, changing in society, not society, but changing where you are in the kind of that ladder of life, and how you have stayed true to your identity, which is respectable. And in your book, you talk about, I'll just read the line exactly, that modifying who you are never leads to true success. And I wanted to almost argue that point a little bit, because, my first thing that came to mind was at Gentro, we talk about how you need to modify your view of the estate planning industry and how you live your life, knowing that you're trying to maintain or build a legacy. And we think that understanding, that changed understanding, would initially modify how people do live. And in thinking this through, I'm almost thinking that there's more than one type of modifying when it comes to your life and what you do change and what you don't change. So I wanted to ask, just, from you directly, what did you mean when you say that modifying who you are does not lead to true success? And if there are multiple types of modifications that come through life, and I say modifying, I should really say like adaptations,
Yeah.
even survival tactics. If there are different kinds of changes that people make, what's the ones that are right to make, wrong to make? How do you balance it? And for you, how have you identified those?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Sorry for the long question, but
No, I think it's great because, when I write it, when I wrote it, I never thought about a different interpretation of those words, and so I appreciate how you thought about it. So my intent in those words were modifying your true self, like who you are at your core, your values as a core, not digressing from that at your core is the modifying I was talking about. But modifying your way of thinking or being curious, like we are always learning and evolving as humans. I am one of the most curious people there is. Like I read everything. I love examining my beliefs. I love examining new technology. I love examining, history. And based on that research or examination, you might realize you might be doing something that's not ideal, and there's a better way to approach life or approach a task or whatever it may be. And so I would say all I've been doing is modifying that over the last 30 years is really how do I become a better human? How do I become a better partner and parent and technology? Like how can I use technology to automate and make things easier? I mean, that's what we're doing right now. So all of that I think is incredibly useful and good. But what I would say is not good is when you start modifying your core values or your identity in order to get approval or acceptance by someone or something. When you're modifying to get external validation, that's when it can be harmful.
Mm-hmm. That's kind of how I figured it would be, the interpretation would be, and I just appreciate you clarifying that, because I think it, someone like me who overthinks everything, I think about moving through life and how modification it just feels necessary. So
Yeah,
the concept that modifying is will never lead to true success. I was like, well, I've adapted a lot. So will I never be successful? But I do think, in thinking it further through, like you said, it's you can modify things to as life changes, because as we all know, life changes. So you're going to have to change with it. But staying true to yourself, I think, really is important. And as it pertains to estate planning, I think that's important, because with identity, I think, comes a sense of honesty. And with honesty, only good things happen, in my opinion. So when you're having these tough conversations with your family, and if you can be honest, and learning to be honest with yourself is kind of the first part of that.
Yes.
It's gonna make just life so much easier, in terms of, instead of trying to kind of wiggle your way out of conversations, be like, oh yeah, I'm sure I'll leave this money to you, or yeah, you'll get the house, but you don't really mean it. Like being able to just be honest at that moment and say, listen, that's not what I want, and it's not what's going to happen, and I'm sorry, and let's find a way to make sure that you can be happy with what does happen. But and that's just through this narrow scope of estate planning, but I think in all facets of life, that honesty, that identity, and that modifying where it's necessary, but not to the point where it's changing who you are, is crucial.
Yeah, those are hard and courageous conversations to have.
Yeah, we talk about it right now like it's nothing, but these are the tough parts of life.
Yes, yeah. And I would say part of this journey to self-acceptance and around identity requires a huge amount of courage, and it requires a huge amount of vulnerability. If you are not vulnerable or willing to be vulnerable with yourself and with others, you can't get to the other side. And I think those same traits matter here in tough conversations around estate planning, being vulnerable to say the hard things and having the courage to do it.
I think a good place to wrap up would be, to you, having gone through this amazing career and changing career, and having written obviously this book that I'm sure a lot of people can relate to, the topics. What advice would you like to, it could be from the book, emphasize, or what advice would you like to give to those particularly starting out today who are struggling with identity, myself included?
Yeah, I mean, I would say first would be to find, find your people. We were talking about groupthink before, and there's some groups that are unwelcoming, but then on the flip side, there are some groups that are very welcoming. And so if there are groups, communities, organizations, family members, friends, mentors that really celebrate who you are, and if you can find a place where you feel safe to be who you are, that's a huge first step. Oftentimes we might be forced into environments that are uncomfortable, or where we're struggling to belong, and so it's very lonely, and you feel like your feelings are not validated. And so being around people that will continuously remind you of how amazing you are, and the things that you're bringing to your community and your family and to your job, and is incredibly necessary. It's not only helpful, but really necessary. And the second thing is, practicing sort of self-awareness around sort of the things that you say to yourself. I think a lot of times those of us that struggle with identity, we're struggling to belong. And so we're saying, well, thinking that we're not good enough. And so what happens is we get into a cycle of what I call negative self-talk, where we have this little voice inside that just keeps reminding us we're not enough. And so the first step to that is really noticing when you're doing that, and then practicing strategies to manage and sort of, quiet that voice. And that would be really things like distinguishing between what you might think is a fact versus a story. So oftentimes negative self-talk comes up because we start perceiving things, and it's a story we've created, and it's not necessarily based on any fact. And so separating and understanding what's kind of really true and what's a story you might have created about a situation. So there's a lot of little tips in my book around managing negative self-talk, but I think it's the first step. Mm-hmm. Oh, and lastly, I would say, I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Go ahead.
I would say that the journey to, if you are someone who is from an, underrepresented identity, whatever that might look like, and you've created all this armor to fit into your situation, know that the journey to really coming into your whole self and being authentic it could be a long one. Mm-hmm. And so it's practicing little steps. And so little steps of revealing those parts of you, that vulnerability, and doing that in safe spaces, and then repeating. So it's small steps repeated often is going to get you to the other side. Yeah, I know I think at every episode so far, I've talked about how
legacy isn't built in a single day. And then I've related that, to every single topic we've had. And yet again, here it is, where identity is not built in a single day, just like how your legacy is not in a day. So take it one day at a time. But I think that's fantastic advice. I know, particularly for the group, saying having a support group, this entire time I've been thinking about this sense of identity, and I'm like, well, that's something I have to figure out and something that I need to do. And it's like, no, you can have a support group, and there are people out there who can support you with it, and mentors and leaders, and it doesn't have to be a solo adventure. There'll be a lot of times, I'm sure, where people, you have to do some inner work, but there are support groups. And then the negative talk, I think that's also fantastic. I actually was, walking the other day, and I saw this little old lady, and she had a sweatshirt, and on the back of it, it said, "To the person behind me, the world is a better place because you're in it." And I'm like, that is an amazing sweatshirt, and I need to find where that is, because I think, granted, I wish I could have just said that to myself instead of having to read it somewhere, but I'm like, that's fantastic. So I think people being able to be a little nicer to themselves in their journey through identity, estate planning, any of this that's perfect advice to end on, I think. So Tricia, I appreciate you being here. I love the conversation we've had. Where can people find your book?
Yeah. So it's on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and anywhere books are sold. You can also find me at my website, triciatimm.com, TRICIATIMM. Yeah, and on LinkedIn and Instagram.
All right. Any last words before we take off here?
I'm excited to be part of Gentrio and its journey, and I think that it's a topic that needs to be spread to all communities, and so thank you for all that you're doing with that.
Well, thank you for all you're doing as well. Both of us helping, hopefully, a lot of people in different ways. Tricia, thank you very much for being on. Hopefully we can see you on here again for the next book.
All right, I know, yeah. Thank you, Jacob.
All right, take care.